The dawn of June 4th, 1942, broke not with gentle light, but with a low, distant rumble that vibrated through the very hulls of the ships. A primordial growl carried across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. This was not the thunder of a storm, but the sound of destiny being forged in the crucible of war. The opening note of a symphony of destruction that would echo through history. The stage was a point of ocean known as Midway, a lonely, insignificant atoll whose strategic significance far outweighed its meager landmass, a pinprick on the map that had become the focal point of two colliding worlds and their irreconcilable doctrines of warfare. The sky, a vast and empty cathedral of pristine blue, was poised to become a charnel house for the dreams of an empire. Below, cutting through the gentle, oily swells with a determined grace that belied the mortal wounds she bore just days prior, the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown turned slowly, laboriously into the wind. Her flight deck, a scarred and weathered plank of wood and steel, trembled as dauntless SBD dive bombers and devastator TBD torpedo planes were pushed into position by deck crews whose faces, smudged with grease and exhaustion, were etched with a grim mixture of fatigue, fear, and an unshakable resolve. Their hands slick with sweat and oil, moved with a practiced, urgent rhythm, checking arrestor hooks, arming bombs with delicate fuses, and offering quiet, clipped words of encouragement to the young pilots, boys in men's bodies, strapping themselves into the cockpits of their fragile machines. Aboard the bridge, the air hung thick with a quiet intensity heavier than the tropical humidity, a palpable pressure that seemed to crush the oxygen from the room. Every officer, every signalman, every helmsman knew the unspoken truth that hung in the air like cordite. They were not just fighting for a single sandy outpost. They were the last thin line standing against the relentless tide of a fanatical enemy, a force that had until now considered the American sailor too soft, too industrial, too decadent to ever master the ancient, brutal art of naval warfare. This is the definitive story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy's deeply ingrained, arrogant dismissal of American technology, doctrine, and spirit, a dismissal that often manifested as open contempt and derisive laughter in the hallowed halls of the Naval General Staff, led them on a deliberate, hubristic march to the precipice of oblivion. It is the epic of the Yorktown-Class, the ships that refused to die, the unsung intelligence officers who broke the code in a stifling basement, and the single, pivotal day that American ingenuity, raw resilience, and a measure of divine luck converged to sink a burgeoning dream of Pacific empire before it could fully solidify. The roots of this climactic confrontation stretched back decades, born in the minds of admirals and the doctrines codified in the war colleges and strategy rooms of Tokyo. There, a singular, almost religious vision of naval combat had taken root and hardened into unassailable dogma, a vision forged in the fire and smoke of their stunning, definitive victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. That battle, a classic crossing of the T, became the immutable template for all future conflict. A perfect engagement where the Japanese fleet, under Admiral Togo, annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet in a display of gunnery and tactical brilliance that cemented Japan's status as a world power. To the Japanese strategists, the ultimate expression of naval power was the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. In this grand theatrical conception of war, the entire conflict would be won or lost in a single colossal and cathartic engagement between two great battle lines of surface ships, a modern reenactment of the line of battle tactics of old, culminating in the thunderous, armor-piercing broadsides of their most powerful weapons, the battleships. They had in fact constructed in absolute, fanatical secrecy the two most formidable battleships ever conceived by man, the Yamato and Musashi, Leviathans of 72,000 tons, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell over an astonishing 26 miles. These were the daisho, the matched swords of the samurai for a new age, immense, floating kami of national pride and unyielding martial spirit, designed to outrange and outgun any vessel the Americans, or any other power, could possibly send against them. American aircraft carriers? They were viewed with condescending skepticism, as scouts, auxiliaries, fragile, floating airfields, useful for spotting the enemy and perhaps harassing his formations, but never as the arbiter of the fleet's destiny. They were the supporting cast, present to soften up the enemy before the real warriors, the majestic battleships, close to within visual range for the final glorious kill. Japanese admirals, steeped in a tradition of offensive spirit and the cult of the battleship, looked at America's burgeoning but largely untested carrier fleet and saw not a revolutionary threat, but a confirmation of their own cultural and strategic superiority. They laughed at the emerging American doctrine, seeing it as a coward's approach, an unrefined, impersonal reliance on machines and long-range attacks over the samurai heart, and the decisive clash of steel against steel. This profound contempt, this catastrophic failure of imagination, was their first and most critical, unforced error, a cognitive trap sprung by their own history and pride, a victory of tradition over foresight. This intellectual rigidity was compounded by a pervasive cultural belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, a conviction that the Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, could overcome any material disadvantage, leading them to dismiss the cold, hard calculus of industrial production and technological innovation as irrelevant in the face of superior will. This mindset created a dangerous feedback loop where intelligence that contradicted their assumptions was often ignored or rationalized away, a flaw that would prove fatal at Midway. Blinded by this myopia, the Japanese high command, particularly the battleship-centric Battleship Club, or Tekikoku, failed entirely to grasp the quiet, relentless revolution brewing within the US Navy's own war colleges and fleet exercises during the 1930s. While they venerated the monolithic, awe-inspiring might of the battleship, American naval thinkers like the fiercely intellectual Admiral Joseph Bull Reeves and later, the notoriously abrasive and brilliant Admiral Ernest J. King, were pioneering a new, heretical form of warfare, one where the aircraft carrier was not a supporting actor, but the star of the show, the new capital ship around which entire fleets would be structured. This was not merely a change in technology, but a fundamental philosophical shift from the Mahanian concept of command of the sea, achieved by fleet engagement, to one of command of the air over the sea, achieved by projecting power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. And at the heart of this nascent, unproven doctrine were three sisters of the Yorktown-Class: the USS Yorktown, CV-5, USS Enterprise, CV-6, and the newly commissioned USS Hornet, CV-8. The Yorktown-Class was the physical embodiment of this new American way of war, a direct and purposeful repudiation of the Kantai-Kessen. At 90,800 tons, they were fast, capable of over 32.5 knots, allowing them to outrun any potential surface threat and position themselves rapidly across the vast theater of the Pacific. They could carry, operate, and sustain an air wing of nearly 90 aircraft, a mix of Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo planes. They were not mere floating platforms. They were sophisticated, integrated weapons systems, mobile air bases with a global reach. Their design, a direct evolution from the experimental conversions of the Lexington class, featured an armored flight deck, a massive, open hangar bay that allowed for rapid rearming and refueling in a continuous cycle of sortie generation, and a powerful and ever-evolving anti-aircraft suite of 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 1.1-inch Chicago piano cannons, and 50 caliber machine guns. They were engineered not for a single glorious battle, but for endurance, for long-range operations across the vast Pacific, and for rapid cycle operations that could unleash hell in successive, overwhelming waves. While the Japanese saw carriers as brittle and auxiliary, the Americans were building them from the keel up to survive, to fight, and to prevail. This fundamental philosophical difference in how to project power at sea, the American embrace of dispersed, air-centric warfare versus the Japanese fixation on concentrated, surface-centric battle, would prove decisive in the crucible of combat. The American approach also fostered a different kind of sailor and officer, one trained for initiative and decentralized command, a stark contrast to the rigid, top-down hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, where junior officers were often discouraged from showing independent thought, a cultural difference that would lead to critical delays and confusion for the Japanese in the heat of battle. The opening months of the war seemed, superficially, to validate Japanese arrogance and reinforce their strategic dogma with the force of revealed truth. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was, after all, a carrier-borne attack of stunning audacity and tactical brilliance. But in the narrow Japanese view, it was a masterstroke that perfectly set the stage for their Kantai-Kessen. It had, in their eyes, crippled the American battleship fleet. the very force they believed the Americans would rely upon for the decisive battle. The subsequent rampage across the Pacific, the lightning fall of Guam, the brutal fight for Wake Island, the tragic defense of the Philippines, the resource-rich prize of the Dutch East Indies, was a seemingly unstoppable tide of Japanese conquest, a blitzkrieg across the ocean that left Allied commanders reeling. Their own carrier force, the WWII, or Mobile Force, was, without question, the most powerful, experienced, and cohesive naval air arm in the world. Its pilots, men like Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida and Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, were veterans of hundreds of combat missions over China, their skills honed to a razor's edge, their confidence unshakable, their belief in their own superiority absolute. Their aircraft were, at the time, largely superior. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter was a revelation of agility and range, sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for breathtaking performance. The Aichi D3A Val dive bomber was deadly accurate in a near-vertical dive. The Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bomber was the most advanced of its kind. They had swept all before them, creating an aura of invincibility that permeated the entire Imperial Navy, from the lowliest seaman to the highest admiral. And then, in April of 1942, came an event that was more psychological insult than military threat: the Doolittle Raid. 16 US Army B-25 Mitchell bombers, a type never designed for carrier operations, launched from the heaving deck of the USS Hornet, a ship so new, her crew was still learning her quirks, managed to penetrate Japanese airspace and drop a few bombs on Tokyo. The material damage was negligible, a few burned buildings and dented pride, but the psychological and strategic impact was seismic. The sacred homeland, the person of the emperor himself, had been violated. The laughter in the admiralties in Tokyo stopped, replaced by a burning, reckless, and ultimately fatal need for revenge, and to eliminate this carrier threat once and for all. This emotional shift from cool, calculated contempt to a furious, emotionally driven need to save face would profoundly cloud their strategic judgment at the most critical moment, directly leading to the complex, overconfident, and fatally flawed plan for Midway, a plan that dispersed their forces and relied on the enemy reacting predictably to their bait, a critical miscalculation of American resolve and intelligence capability. Thus, the stage was set for the battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese target was Midway Atoll, a strategic speck that would extend their defensive perimeter and, more importantly, serve as the irresistible bait to lure the remnants of the American carrier fleet into the decisive battle they so desperately craved. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the complex and brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor, assembled a colossal, sprawling armada split into multiple, dispersed forces, over 200 ships in total, including 11 battleships, with the mighty Yamato serving as his flagship, a floating fortress awaiting its moment, 8 carriers, though only 4 of them were the frontline veterans of the WWII, and a host of cruisers, destroyers, transports, and support vessels. It was the most powerful fleet Japan would ever send to sea, a testament to their total commitment to the Kantai-Kessen ideal. The plan, however, was labyrinthine in its complexity, a hallmark of a command structure overconfident in its own cleverness and dismissive of the enemy's capability to react or disrupt their intricate timetable. It involved a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, a landing force for Midway, a screening force, and the main carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. They sailed, believing they held all the cards, convinced through a combination of arrogance and poor intelligence that the Americans had only 2 operational carriers left, the Enterprise and Hornet. The Yorktown, they were certain based on inflated and uncorroborated after-action reports from the Coral Sea, was resting on the bottom of the ocean, a victim of their pilot's earlier claims. This catastrophic intelligence failure was the second fatal flaw, born directly from that initial underestimation of American resilience and industrial capability. They could not conceive that the Americans possessed the shipyard capacity, the engineering skill, and the sheer, stubborn tenacity to repair a mortally wounded carrier in a matter of days, not months. They had failed to account for the spirit of a nation now fully awakened, enraged, and possessed of an industrial muscle that was just beginning to flex. A nation that could turn its assembly lines into arsenals of democracy with an efficiency that dwarfed Japan's own strained production capabilities. This misjudgment was compounded by failures in their own reconnaissance and a stubborn belief in the inviolability of their JN-25 naval code, which they periodically changed, but whose underlying principles had been deeply compromised by American cryptanalysts. But in the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard, a miracle of American industry and determination was underway, a silent, gritty rebuttal to Japanese assumptions about American softness and incompetence. The Yorktown, limping into port on May 27th, was a horrific sight, a testament to the violence she had endured at the Coral Sea. A 500-pound bomb had blown a gaping hole in her flight deck, started raging internal fires, and killed or wounded dozens of her crew. Her structural frames were twisted like pretzels, her aviation fuel lines severed, her innards scorched and blackened. The initial assessment from the yard engineers was bleak and realistic. 90 days of repairs, minimum. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the calm, unflappable strategic mastermind of the Pacific Fleet, visited the dry-docked carrier. He looked at the devastation, the smoke still rising from her wounds, then at the yard manager. "We must have this ship back in 3 days," he said quietly, his voice leaving no room for argument. It was not a request. It was a strategic necessity. What followed was a spectacle of American industrial democracy in its rawest, most powerful form. 1,500 welders, electricians, shipfitters, carpenters, and engineers, working in shifts around the clock, swarmed over the wounded giant like ants repairing their hill. The sound of rivet guns and arc welders created a constant, deafening symphony of reconstruction that echoed day and night across the harbour. They cut away twisted steel with torches, patched the flight deck with temporary plates, restored vital systems with a focus on pure function, not form or perfection. Cafeterias stayed open 24 hours a day to feed the relentless workforce. There was no time for elegance, only for battle-worthiness. This was the unglamorous brute force answer to Japanese martial elegance. It was not the way of the samurai, but the way of the machine shop, the way of a nation that could outproduce, out-innovate, and outwork any enemy on Earth through collective will and sheer effort. On the morning of May 30th, a mere 72 hours after entering dry dock, the Yorktown, still belching smoke from her temporary repairs, with repair plates still visible like fresh scars on her hull and a crew supplemented by volunteers from the shipyard itself, eased out of Pearl Harbor to join Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Her air group, a cobbled-together mix of Coral Sea survivors and fresh-faced replacements from the USS Saratoga, readied themselves for a fight they knew was coming, their morale soaring at the sight of their resurrected ship, a phoenix rising from the dry dock. The Japanese believed they were hunting a crippled, demoralized foe. They were, in fact, sailing blindly into a trap sprung by a ghost, a trap whose outlines had been revealed to the Americans through the brilliant, painstaking cryptanalytic work of Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo, who had painstakingly broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25, and now knew the enemy's plan, his location, and his intent, allowing Nimitz to position his outnumbered forces with the precision of a chess master, lying in wait northeast of Midway along the predicted line of approach. The battle's opening acts unfolded with a terrifying, seemingly inexorable momentum that appeared, to the Japanese commanders on the bridge of the Akagi, to be validating their entire war strategy and cultural worldview. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, from the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 veteran jewels of the Kido Butai, a first wave of 108 Kate and Val bombers, escorted by agile Zeros, roared off into the growing light to pound Midway's defences into dust. The coordinated launch was a masterpiece of naval air operations, a breathtaking ballet of precision and power, a testament to their unparalleled skill and hard-won experience. Meanwhile, American PBY Catalina patrol planes, flying tedious grid-pattern searches through the vast emptiness, had already located the Japanese fleet. The game was afoot, and the Americans, for once, could see the board. What happened over the next few hours was a study in chaos, unimaginable courage, and catastrophic failure that nearly cost the Americans the battle before it had truly begun. The first American waves to find the enemy, the slow, obsolete, and underpowered Devastator TBD torpedo bombers from the Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, the Enterprise's VT-6, and the Yorktown's VT-3 located the Japanese carriers without the protection of their own fighter cover, which had been mistakenly drawn down to low level by other contacts. What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval history. The Devastators, lumbering and vulnerable, flew low and slow, a mere 50 feet above the water, to launch their unreliable Mark 13 torpedoes, which had a tendency to run deep or fail to detonate even if they did hit. They had to hold a straight and level course for an agonizingly long run-in, making them perfect slow-moving targets for the enemy's guns. One after another, the slow, canvas-skinned Devastators were swarmed by the faster, more maneuverable Zeros, and shredded by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire from the screening ships. They were shot to pieces, falling into the sea in flaming cartwheeling arcs. Of the 41 Devastators that attacked that morning, 35 were annihilated. VT-8 was wiped out to a man, with only a single survivor, Ensign George H. Gay, watching the battle unfold from the water. They scored not a single hit. In the command centers of the Japanese carriers, a sense of euphoric victory mixed with profound contempt took hold. The American pilots, they thought, were brave but tragically incompetent, their sacrifice pointless. Their equipment was pathetically inferior, their tactics primitive and suicidal. The decisive battle was unfolding exactly as their doctrine had prophesied. The enemy was throwing himself on their swords. The flight decks of the Japanese carriers were now crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed and refueled for a second, definitive strike, this time against the located American fleet. Bombs and torpedoes, hastily swapped from land attack to anti-ship ordnance, lay in untidy piles in the open. Long fuel hoses snaked across the wooden planking, creating a volatile, explosive environment. The Kido Butai was at its most vulnerable, a floating, unshielded tinderbox. Utterly convinced of its own invincibility, its commanders' minds clouded by the intoxicating fumes of an easy victory and their own deeply held prejudices. A fatal combination of operational success and strategic blindness that left them completely unprepared for the blow about to fall from the heavens. But what seemed like American weakness, desperation and abject failure was, in fact, setting the stage for a miracle of timing and convergence that would defy all odds. The sacrificial slaughter of the torpedo bombers was not in vain. In drawing the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to the deck, and in keeping the Japanese carriers maneuvering violently and unable to launch or recover aircraft, they had performed an unwitting, deadly service. They had left the sky above the Japanese fleet naked, undefended, and utterly exposed to a threat from above, and into that void, descending from 20,000 feet, like avenging angels materializing from the blinding sun, came the squadrons of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown. They had been lost, searching in vain for over an hour, their fuel gauges dipping dangerously towards empty, their mission seemingly on the verge of joining the torpedo squadrons in total tragic failure. Then, by a confluence of chance, a critical command decision, and sheer, breathtaking luck, the Enterprise's Air Group commander, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, made a choice to continue the search rather than turn back, spotting the faint, thin wake of the lagging Japanese destroyer Arashi, which was racing north to rejoin Nagumo's force after depth-charging an American submarine. He turned to follow this slender thread on the ocean. It was a decision that changed the course of the war in the Pacific, and consequently, the world. Over the horizon, he and his exhausted, fuel-starved pilots stumbled upon the prize of the Imperial Japanese Navy. There was no resistance. The sky was clear of Zeros. For a breathtaking, silent moment, the pilots of VS-6 and VB-3 had a perfect, unobstructed view of their prey spread out below them like toys in a bathtub. The carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, their decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, looking, as one pilot later recalled with awe, like a kid's model setup, perfect and untouched. The following 5 minutes were a symphony of destruction, orchestrated with clinical, terrifying precision. The Dauntless, a robust, stable, and incredibly accurate aircraft, nosed over into their signature near-vertical 70-degree dives. The scream of their perforated dive brakes became the sound of impending doom for the Japanese fleet, a high-pitched whistle that announced the end of an era. On the deck of the carrier Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo, the lookouts finally saw the tiny growing specks in the sun and screamed the warning, but it was far too late. The first 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Richard H. Best's section struck the Akagi squarely amid the parked aircraft, detonating the ordnance and fuel that littered the deck in a chain reaction of fire. A second bomb smashed through the flight deck near the amidships elevator, exploding in the hangar bay among more armed and fueled aircraft. In seconds, the ship was transformed into an uncontrollable inferno. Steering disabled, communications shattered, Admiral Nagamo forced to evacuate his burning flagship in a scene of utter chaos. The same scene of apocalyptic destruction played out simultaneously on the Kaga, which took 4 direct hits that turned her into a blazing pyre, and the Soryu, which was hit by 3 bombs from the Enterprise's squadrons, her internal spaces instantly becoming an oven. Direct hits on their crowded flight decks triggered catastrophic, sympathetic secondary explosions as bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel ignited in a chain reaction of fire and shrapnel that tore the ships apart from within. The very efficiency and speed of the Japanese rearming process, the concentration of their offensive power for a single, killing blow, became the engine of their own instantaneous annihilation. The carefully choreographed dance of the Kido Butai, a force that had ranged unchecked across the Pacific for 6 months, had been shattered in less than 300 seconds by a few dozen men in a screaming dive. In the time it takes to boil an egg, the strategic balance of the entire Pacific War had been irrevocably shattered, and the myth of Japanese invincibility was consumed in the fireballs rising thousands of feet into the pristine Pacific sky, a stark and brutal lesson in the new realities of naval warfare, where the decisive weapon was not the battleship's gun, but the dive bomber's bomb. Yet the battle was not over. The one Japanese carrier that had been separated by chance and escaped the initial onslaught, the Hiryu, lived up to its name, Flying Dragon. Under the determined and aggressive command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the Hiryu launched 2 swift and effective counterstrikes that finally found the USS Yorktown. It was here that the resilience and damage control philosophy that American naval architects had baked into the Yorktown-Class from their very inception was put to the ultimate, brutal test. The first wave, a group of Val dive bombers, plunged through a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire and desperate attacks by American Wildcat fighters. They scored 3 devastating hits on the Yorktown. One bomb exploded deep in the stack, rupturing uptakes and snuffing out the fires in her boilers, bringing the great ship to a dead stop in the water. Another started a fierce hangar deck fire among parked aircraft, while a third exploded in her aviation storeroom, killing many of the damage control parties stationed there. The ship shuddered to a halt, shrouded in a pall of black and oily smoke. But she did not sink. Her highly trained, rigorously drilled damage control parties fought the blazes with disciplined fury, patched holes, and miraculously restored power. Within 2 hours, to the astonishment of the Hiryu's pilots, who had reported her sunk with certainty, the Yorktown was underway again, making 20 knots, her flags flying. A second wave of Kate torpedo bombers then found her. Pressing their attack with equal bravery and skill, they put 2 long-lance torpedoes into her port side. The blows were mortal. The great ship took on a heavy, uncontrollable list. Her power failed again, and this time the order was finally given to abandon ship. Her crew, many in tears, took to the water, watching in heartbreak as their ship, their home, lay dying. The Ghost, having absorbed the full fury of the Kido Butai's last gasp, had finally taken a mortal blow. But even in her death throes, the Yorktown had achieved her final vital purpose. Her surviving scout planes had, with tenacious courage, tracked the retreating Hiryu's aircraft back to their source, alerted to the location of the last Japanese carrier. A final wave of aircraft from the Enterprise and Hornet located the Hiryu that evening and, in a final, vengeful strike, sent her to the bottom with 4 bomb hits. The Kido Butai, the very heart, soul, and sharpened sword of Japanese naval air power, was completely and irrevocably destroyed. Its glory extinguished in the deep, cold waters of the Pacific, a devastating blow to both Japanese military capability and national morale from which they would never fully recover. The silence that fell over the Pacific in the days following June 4, 1942, was deafening, broken only by the cries of survivors in the water and the slow, mournful progress of the American task forces retrieving their men. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a loss from which it would never truly recover. 4 frontline aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, over 330 aircraft, and, most devastatingly, an entire cadre of over 110 irreplaceable, Veteran pilots and aircrew, the institutional knowledge and the very soul of their naval air arm wiped out in a single, stunning afternoon. America had lost the gallant Yorktown, finally succumbing to a Japanese submarine's torpedoes days later as she was under tow, and the destroyer, Hammond. But the Yorktown's legacy was not one of loss, but of salvation and redemption. Her defiant, almost impossible sortie from Pearl Harbor, her absorption of the Hiryu's entire counterpunch, and the raw valor of her air group and crew had been the pivotal, indispensable factors in the American victory. The Japanese admirals were no longer laughing. The doctrine they had ridiculed as cowardly and unrefined had not only defeated them, it had annihilated their primary strategic weapon and proven their core war-fighting philosophy to be a dangerous, obsolete relic of a bygone age. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, the great, silent, and costly symbols of their Kantai Kessen, would spend the rest of the war as fuel-starved fugitives, their thunderous guns rendered strategically irrelevant by a new master of the seas that they had refused to acknowledge until it was too late. The American industrial machine, which the Japanese had so profoundly misunderstood and underestimated, now began to churn out Essex-class carriers in such numbers, a ship a month, that the very ocean seemed to sprout them, creating a fleet of which the once vaunted WWII was merely a small and tragic precursor. The war in the Pacific became a relentless, grinding, and utterly predictable advance, a testament to the new, brutal truth born amidst the smoke and fire of Midway. The aircraft carrier was the new capital ship, the undisputed arbiter of naval destiny, and the empire of the sun, which had risen so brilliantly and violently, had set forever upon its discovery. The Yorktowns, and the men who designed, built, repaired, and sailed them, had not just won a battle against impossible odds. They had sunk an empire and forged a new world order upon the anvil of the sea, proving for all time that the future of war would be won not by the unyielding strength of tradition, but by the fluid power of adaptation, the sharp edge of intelligence, and an indomitable will to fight on, no matter the cost, until the dawn finally broke. A dawn secured by the sacrifice and ingenuity of those who fought at Midway. The battle stands as an eternal testament to the fact that in war, it is not always the most historically triumphant or culturally confident force that prevails, but rather the one most capable of learning, adapting, and harnessing the full measure of its national spirit and industrial might in the face of overwhelming adversity.